Welcome to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. We are starting a series, Understanding Domestic Violence. Knowledge is Empowerment. The podcast series dedicated to uncovering the truth about domestic violence and empowering you with the tools and knowledge to create change. In this series, we'll explore the many dimensions of domestic violence: physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and beyond. Each episode is designed to educate, challenge misconceptions, and provide actionable insight for individuals, families, and communities. Because the more we understand, the more equipped we are to recognize the signs, support survivors, and prevent domestic violence. Today on Illuminating Hope, CEO Marianne Matheny and I talked to Jenny and Tracey. Jenny is a compassionate clinical service coordinator and adult therapist dedicated to supporting individuals on their journey toward healing and personal growth. Jenny's empathetic approach and commitment to a safe, supportive environment make her an invaluable ally in her clients' wellness journeys. Tracey is a skilled family service specialist and therapist with a deep passion for strengthening families and promoting resilience. Tracey's approach, combined with her dedication to understanding and connection, ensures her clients feel seen, supported, and empowered. I do want to pause for a moment because I think it's important to say in this conversation, we'll use pronouns she, her for the survivor and he, him for the abuser, fully understanding that domestic violence happens to all. Jenny and Tracey, welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay, so today what I want to talk about is the Domestic Violence Power and Control Wheel. So the Domestic Violence Intervention Project from Duluth, Minnesota, for our listeners, developed the Power and Control Wheel following multiple focus groups with domestic violence survivors. And the wheel documents the abusive behaviors which these women were most frequently subjected to. And I know that you both work directly with our clients. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about maybe some examples of the Power and Control Wheel. But first, Marianne, can you describe what the Power and Control Wheel consists of?
The wheel is cut up like a pie or like a wheel with the spokes. And so when we talk about the Power and Control Wheel, it helps us to explain what domestic violence is. It's a great way to talk to survivors about it, but it's also a great way to educate the community because domestic violence is so complex and it's really can be very difficult to understand. So we wanted to take the opportunity to really take this wheel and dissect it and spend some time talking about those different sections, how it's carried out, how an abuser might use these different techniques, why an abuser might use these techniques. And then I think it's also really impactful to talk about how a person that's on the other end of that, that's experiencing someone using one of these techniques, and what then we can do to help them work through that and help them to be able to heal from the trauma of having experienced this. Mm-hmm. So we're going to look at 4 different sections during this conversation. So I think the first one that we would like to talk about then is using economic abuse. What is economic abuse?
So economic abuse is keeping women from having any financial support. When we talk about child support, they're supposed to get child support. They're either getting it at the wrong time or they're getting less than they're supposed to as a way of keeping them from being able to sustain themselves independently. Been doing this for a long time. When I first started here, we didn't have women that even got child support. They just didn't receive it. Now I see more women receiving it, but again, it's a manipulation. It's, okay, I'll pay you at a different time than you're supposed to get it, and I'll pay you at different amounts, so that you're always wondering what you're getting and how much you're getting. I mean, abusers are very good at just doing a little bit to prove power and control, but then they can back off of it so they can say, well, yes, I did pay you, but no, I'm not getting it when I'm supposed to. Plus, they also will supposed to pay it, which might throw her out of getting any other assistance, but they're not getting it. Or they say that they fight for 50-50 and get 50-50, so she's not getting anything, but yet they're not taking the kids. So that is one way that I see child support being used as a way of of keeping women from really being able to sustain themselves and be independent.
Also with the child support, oftentimes they will stop a job where they make a huge amount of money and take a job where they make a lot less. So therefore, the amount of wages or the child support that's given is much less. Or they will also go job to job, so you can't find them, you don't know where they're currently at. Or oftentimes they have to have their wages garnished even to get a small amount. There's definitely them taking back that control.
I think what's interesting about that example, which is something we've talked about before, is that the abuse continues even after someone has left. And we've spent time talking about that on this podcast because a lot of times people really think if that person just leaves, it's over and it's done and they can move on. I think we really need to be able to talk more about that abuse continues. And this is a prime example of how this technique is used. Can talk more about what happens if someone's in the relationship and how economic abuse can impact them. But it also is really, really important to emphasize that it happens after they've left as well.
Plenty of women who left where he takes all of the money, and she's been a stay-at-home mom, takes all of the money, doesn't pay the rent. Abusers are all about what meets their immediate needs. So it doesn't matter that in the end his credit's going to be bad. He's not thinking about that. He's thinking about how this is going to affect her and keep her from being able to sustain herself and sustain feeding her kids. A lot of that financial happens after. I primarily work with clients trying to co-parent.
Also oftentimes use the legal system afterwards too. The more you're in court, you're hiring attorneys to try to
I'll
help
give you child support, but I'm just going to keep filing motions. So you have to keep going to court. You can't work because you have to keep going to court. You can pay that lawyer. You're not going to get my money to be using for the kids. And I might lose, but you still have to pay an attorney. You still have to take time off work to be at court. I've had that happen a lot.
Do you think that some of the economic abuse can be he just wants her to have to ask him for money so he continually has the control in the relationship?
If he wants her back, that's one way of trying to get her back, is to make her so dependent that she has to return. And lots of women that have returned because they cannot sustain financially without his help. A lot of the moms I work with have been stay-at-home moms.
And I do feel like economic abuse is one of the things that keep people from leaving that relationship. They realize how difficult it will be for them to financially support themselves because they don't have any resources currently to take with them. And so that makes it very, very difficult for them to even think about leaving.
Well, I think that let's talk a little bit more about that is what are some of the things that happen when the relationship is still intact that someone would use economic abuse, and how would that be to keep them in the relationship?
I think making it difficult for them to get and keep a job, and they do that by getting in fights with them before they go to work so that they're upset before they even get to work, saying I will watch the kids so you can work, but then doing such a poor job of it that they can't count on it, or at the last minute saying I'm not watching the kids, doing stuff with the car so they don't have transportation. So when she loses the job, they can turn around and say, see, you can't even keep a job, so you can't leave me, you can't even stay employed. But it's because of the way the abuser is treating her, or she has bruises on her and she has to call into work, or he refuses to let her go into work. Again, it's a way of keeping her tied to him. Or if she does work, he takes the money and uses it for his own purposes so that she has to scramble to money for diapers or money for food to feed the kids. Or
they don't have access at all to any of the financial resources. So they have a checking account that they don't have any access to that. They don't have the ability to use a card, or if they do have a debit card or a credit card, it's, oh, you can have it for this long, but you can only spend this amount, and if you spend more than this amount, we're going to have to talk about what you did. Or so there's a lot of demands on. There's just no limited access.
I mean, everything, the goalposts move, right? So even if you are able to manage within what they've allotted you, then they just change it so that you never do good enough, or you can never live up to their expectation that they have for you. Then they just change it. And I'm not sure it's always so blatant as you only have this much money, but she knows she's going to catch it no matter what. You know, you were there too long at the grocery store. You were only supposed to spend this much. Why did you buy that?
I think when we talk about any of these kind of control methods, let's talk about how it is that I think people are often surprised when we say to them they didn't have any access to the checking account, or they worked and they were the one bringing in the money, but they didn't have access to that. Can you expand on that and really talk about how that happened? That can be really difficult for people to understand, that this amount of control is happening in a relationship, that you can be be the sole provider and have no access to that money at all.
I think like a lot of different things within the relationship, you just get used to how things are. You spend a lot of time pacifying. So if the abuser says, look, you don't know, I'm in charge because I know more than you do and I'm smarter than you are and I get to make the decisions in order to keep the peace, which is what you're doing in the relationship 24/7, you're not going to stand up. What can you say? You're not going to stand up, and you might, but you just end up going along with it until behaviors just become normal because you live it so long that pretty soon you don't even realize that other people are doing things differently because it just becomes a part of how you have to manage, and your brain deals with what's normal. It doesn't necessarily deal with what's healthy. It just becomes normal that this is just the way we do things in our family.
For lack of a better term, you get comfortable in the chaos because that's all you know. You normalize that.
Doesn't mean you like it or you prefer it or you want it. It means that is how you have been able to create normalcy or safety. Thank you.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Definitely is the way that they maintain their safety, by following the instructions or the directions that they're being given, because there's always consequences if they don't. Even sometimes when they're allowed to be what's considered covering the finances or in control of some financial stuff, there's still consequences for them, because at the end of the month, what'd you do with that money? Where did it go? Why did you spend so much here? Why is the electric bill that much? And oftentimes people will put bills in our survivors' names, and so when they go to try to leave, they have debt. Those bills do not get paid off, and then they cannot gain access to resources later to be able to put things in their own name. It creates barrier for them to be able to even think about leaving.
I mean, one of the things we know is that there's a disassociation that happens when you're in a relationship where there's domestic violence. You tend to focus on what is positive and you minimize what's negative in order to cope with the whole relationship. And that's why we have women that get out of relationships where they're getting bricks thrown through their car windows and they're talking to you like they're walking next door to get a loaf of bread. It doesn't even register anymore that these things are not acceptable because their brain goes with what's normal, not what's healthy. And they've just adapted the best they could to any of these things that the rest of us would cringe at. They just have adapted that this is just the way it is in order to cope.
And that's because, let's go ahead and segue into emotional abuse. So what you're talking about is having trauma brain and being under a lot of trauma. So can you tell us a little bit about what your experience is with survivors who have had emotional abuse, which I'm going to assume that statistic is very high.
I would say all
100%.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's the physical abuse is bad, but it's the emotional abuse that you take with you once you leave. Yeah. It's what stays in your head and tells you can't do this or you can't do that. And so that's what we as therapists have to help them with. Tears down their spirit. Whatever they have been told over and over again is what they now believe.
It's the put downs, it's the criticism, it's that constant you're not enough messages that they're being given until they start playing those tapes in their head themselves. It starts becoming the voice that they hear constantly. And so for them to take that and to try to heal from that when you're in that environment, it's really hard to heal from something like that when you're constantly being re-traumatized, you're constantly being re-victimized during that process. And so
just trying to survive.
Mm-hmm. And that's when we talk about gaslighting, pushing your buttons until you blow up or get emotional, so the abuser can turn around and say, see, look at how crazy you are. Because if they can make other people believe that you're crazy, then it delegitimizes anything that you really have to say. And so you feel crazy, and you have somebody telling you you're crazy, and somebody who's using every vulnerability that they know about you that makes you feel like, well, maybe they do know what they're saying. And that power is so significant once they leave. When I work with victims, they'll tell me, well, he says, well, he doesn't have the power. He said he could walk in my house anytime he wanted. It's not his house. But in their head, it's still everything he says is the truth. He has all this power. That continues once you leave, that idea that I can't take care of the kids, that I'm nothing without this person. I just had a client who, she's been separated for over 6 months, just went to the grocery store and bought what she wanted. First time in 6 months, because it's so indoctrinated in her that he likes this brand, or she was buying things she didn't even eat because it's still in her head that this is just the way we do things. So we as therapists have to
come back to that safety measure too. I mean, it's so much easier if you're just doing what you're being told to do, so that way you can protect not only yourself but those that are in the household with you, and they're constantly thinking about what's keeping us safe. And they do start believing that they're crazy because it must be me. I must be the problem because they're telling me I'm the problem. I feel like I'm the problem. And that's a huge factor that they deal with when they leave or even during the relationship time.
I think part of that is that the abuser will continue to show them that they will do those things too. So it isn't like that belief system is so out there, because they show over and over and over again that I will continue to insert myself into your life and to do these things and show you that I still have control. It makes it even that much harder for you to start to really understand what was nonsense and what wasn't true and what is true. They continue to show you why they continue to have that power.
And that's especially true when there's kids involved.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that if you don't take every phone call when we're not together, then you're alienating me from the kids. Or I have a right to talk to my kid whenever I want to. And so being able to say, okay, let's look at this. No, you don't have to stop everything you're doing 20 times a day, but they think they do, because their fear is so great that, well, he says he's going to take the kids from me if I don't let him talk to him anytime he wants to, or if he shows up at the door, I have to let him in, because that fear is so great, and they've been so manipulated into thinking that this person is all powerful, and there's enough evidence to prove that they have the power that they say that they do.
So anytime a mistake is made, so they've been told over and over and over again that they're not smart enough, they're not whatever it is, they're not enough of, and then when those mistakes happen again, then those tapes come back, or that abuser comes back and says, see, I told you you were stupid, I told you didn't know how to do this, I told you that you needed me, because if you don't have me, then you can't make these decisions on your own. We can't minimize that. I think that the way that those tapes play in are backed up with action. So it's not like people are just making this up. There are steps and actions that have happened and continue to happen to make it feel like those things are still very real.
And that is the reality. They could continue to happen. I mean, we've seen that time and time again for our survivors, is that the actions that they're threatening to do, they are doing. And so they have to deal with the fact that, okay, when can I put that in place? When can I have that boundary? What can I do?
That's kind of a nice segue right in threats and using the coercion and threat. I don't think we can really emphasize enough how important this piece is and how powerful this piece is. So do you want to talk about how using threats come into play in abusive relationships?
Using threats is huge, because it definitely gives that other person the control over somebody. If they're able to say, if you do this, I'm going to do that, or I'll take our kids, you'll never see them again, or I'm going to kill you and our kids. I mean, those are huge things that people have to take very seriously, and you're going to go ahead and do what that person is saying in order to make sure those things don't happen, or at least try to figure out what can I do to make sure that to keep my family and myself safe in those instances. But it holds a lot of power over another individual. That's why it's so key in this, because that's what keeps people from leaving and branching out and trying to do things, because they know that other person, they're not sure that they wouldn't follow through on the things that they're saying that they would do.
Right.
I mean, I think that when we think physical abuse is the only abuse that's powerful, it's not. The words, the aggressive talking, the getting in your face and threatening you, it's just as powerful as physical abuse that you might experience, because you believe it. Believe that they're going to follow through and do what they say they're going to do. And again, that fear gets in your head. I better do that's a safety thing. They have you believing that if you don't do what they say, that they have all the power to do whatever they want.
Because there's been action behind those threats. That's
Absolutely.
why. I remember talking to survivors, and they would say, he didn't say a word. Not one word was spoken, but
Right.
I knew what was going to happen, because the gun was laying there on the table. No words needed to be spoken, because he got the gun out and put it on the table. I knew right then what was going to happen if I didn't do what he told me to do.
And it's those words and gestures that other people may not pick up on, but you become very aware of those gestures and the looks, the things like taking a knife out, or so that the abuser can turn around and say, well, I never threatened you with it. I don't know why you're afraid with it. Or I just punched the wall. I didn't punch you. I don't know why you're so scared of me, which factually is true. But if somebody's going to punch the wall, the next step is they're going to punch you, or if they kick the dog. And so, as I said earlier, abusers are very good at doing the minimum to make sure that they keep you under control, but they can back out of it, or they can twist it around to make it seem like, oh, you're overreacting, or you're just trying to get me in trouble, or you don't know what you're talking about. I had a client who he shot the gun into the ceiling, and the police came out and asked her if he threatened her with the gun, and she said, no, he didn't threaten me. She said, well, he didn't hold it at me. He shot the ceiling. Well, most of us would take that as a threat. She had been told over and over again, well, I shot the ceiling. I didn't shoot you, so I don't know what you're complaining about. So those little gestures that are very powerful in getting you to do what they want you to do, whether they physically physically hurt you or not.
And that coincides with that emotional abuse because of the gaslighting you talked about, which gaslighting would be playing mind games with somebody. And sometimes it's even for the abuser's own pleasure, which is just mightily disgusting. Let's talk a little bit about support systems for survivors of domestic violence, because I know that there are some survivors who feel very isolated, which using isolation is one of the spokes on the wheel that we want to cover today. So let's talk a little bit about what happens to the support system. How do abusers isolate a survivor?
I don't think it's always, no, you can't go see those people. But it's, yeah, you can go see those people, but then there's such a backlash when they do that they choose not to go out with your friends. But I'm going to call you every 5 minutes and you better pick up. I'm going to be driving by, or you better take a picture of where you're at. But then the accusations start. You need to prove to me that you weren't out with somebody, to the point where I think sometimes survivors are just like, I don't even want to deal with it. Or in that way. The other thing is, if your family or friends are aware that you're in an abusive relationship, sometimes that's what they want to talk about. So you go out with them and they're like, I don't know why you don't leave him. Sometimes we isolate ourselves. It's too much work. It's not fun if we have to always be defending ourselves, or we have bruises, tend to have a charming personality and they can fool other people. So sometimes people don't even believe what's going on because, oh, he wouldn't do that. Helped me with my car last week, or he just loaned me $20. You guys are just need to work it out. It's not as bad. And so you just don't bring it up anymore, talk about it.
And you also have the events where that person will go with you to an event and then act up or pull you aside or make a big scene. And so you're in this event trying to get out of, trying to leave as quickly as you possibly can because you know that you need to get out of there before other people are aware. Yeah, it's very embarrassing for them. Or the abuser will say, this person doesn't like me, so you shouldn't hang out with them, or they're bad for our relationship, or they're trying to get between us. And so they've really cut off any support system that they feel like could potentially help our survivors, because those people want them to be constantly dependent on only them. If that's your only source of support, who do you feel like you can go to and count on? Well, that's the person you go to, because you don't have friends and family and people in your life anymore that will be, or they're telling you don't have those support networks, and building those roadblocks to make sure that you feel like they're no longer available to you.
And they control social media, they control who you're talking to on the phone, they control all of that access also, along with, you can't be friends with that person anymore because for whatever reason.
When you look at the wheel and the different spokes, I think there's a lot of interaction between when you use threats, that causes isolation. And so I think just also looking at that these aren't just individual sections or individual pies as part of this wheel, but that they all interact with each other and they all have consequences that lead into the next thing that happens. Because I think if you say, you know what, if you go see your mother, then there's some threat, I will come after your mother, I'll come after your dog, or whatever it is. So that threat then causes that isolation, that they come back and say, well, I didn't tell you that you couldn't go see them. So then that emotional abuse comes into that as well. It's like just really seeing how it's all just one big intertwined web. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking of that. So rather than it being a wheel, it's more like it is.
And then when you have your survivors that are trying to detangle that web, you're peeling back layer after layer because it is so entangled and so difficult for them to be able to process and manage. Just each spoke. It's not individualized. It's not all just, this is emotional abuse. It just fits nicely into this little concept.
And as you said earlier, this doesn't stop once you leave. Even the isolation, we have abusers who will not be around till the victim starts dating, or is still controlling her and following her and controlling what she does, with the idea that we have kids together, so you can't have this person at the house, or these kids can't be around that family member. It doesn't end.
I think you hit on a great point when you were describing an abuser profile sometimes, where they just seem so nice, and I'm sure that survivors of domestic violence have heard, I can't imagine that he'd really do that. He's always seemed so nice. He's always been nice to me. He's always helping me. And that's part of the using the isolation, because guess what you've just done? You've not believed her. The survivor tries to reach out, and they were all of a sudden not believed. And that's why it's so important to believe somebody when they come to you.
And what they hear sometimes is, well, I wouldn't let somebody treat me that way.
Right.
So that again puts it back on the victim, like, well, you're just not tough enough or strong. You just don't put your foot down enough. And so who's going to speak up if that's what you're hearing? Just the way that we tend to then go back and blame the victim for not being able to get out of the situation. Or
That's why it's so important when we meet with our survivors to have the time to talk about this power and control wheel. There's so many aspects that they're like, oh, yeah, that piece is right. And this is this, and they can highlight like almost the whole wheel and be like, yeah. But it really gives them that knowledge that yes, this really did happen to me. Yes, even though they can be charming and charismatic, I'm being believed. I know somebody is hearing what I'm really saying and recognizing.
And there's power when you hand somebody a piece of paper, a tool, like what the power and control wheel is, and they look at it for the first time and say, I'm not crazy.
We talk to people all the time who say, I'm not really a victim because I didn't experience this or this or this, but being able to look at this and showing how the physical violence and the sexual violence is like the rim of the wheel, and it encompasses all of it, but being able to show that there's so many other ways, there's so many other things that happen that are also abusive, as what you were saying, Jenny, is just to be believed and to be heard. And often it's the first time that they felt like anyone has ever heard them, not judged them, not blamed them, and said, you're not crazy, there's nothing wrong with you other than you have experienced trauma beyond what anyone should ever experience, and that's not about you, but the impact of that is about you.
that word victim is sometimes difficult for women to buy into. Say, I'm not a victim. Because they don't understand that what that means is there was something done to you that you didn't have control over. Not that you are beaten down, or not that it's saying anything negative about you. And I've had to change that sometimes in group and call it something else because it can be offensive to some of my survivors.
I think also sometimes the wheel helps them realize, wow, I really was abused. I didn't even want to identify that. I didn't even want to say that. But this was going on. And so, therefore, I am not crazy. Somebody else's actions and behaviors have led to this situation, and I'm not the problem, because they often come in saying, well, if I just did this and did this differently, then he wouldn't get mad, things would be okay, but I can't seem to stop doing X, Y, or Z that makes them mad, when we all know they changed what is X, Y, and Z for this individual. So oftentimes the wheel helps them recognize for the first time that, wow, it was abuse, and it's okay to say that was what was really going on.
And in the middle of it all, explains it. The power and control is in the middle, and that's what domestic violence is about. It's about someone exerting power and control over another person in that relationship and how they do that. But I think if we can also emphasize that that's what this is about, and whatever tactic someone uses, whatever an abuser uses, is to maintain that power and control. I think, to go back to what we talked about earlier, when someone leaves the relationship, that power and control then is gone. You don't have that power and control over them anymore. So that's when we see these things being used even in a greater degree, and we see more lethal methods, and we see the methods being increased dramatically, the stalking, and so the taking things to the next level because they need to get that power and control back.
One of the most dangerous times for those individuals. And so, once again, I feel like this wheel is just knowledge and power for them, to help give them some of their control back, to help them recognize and realize the situation for what it is, but also, if I want to regain my own control, how do I do that? What's that look like?
Tracey and Jenny, thank you so much for coming on today, because I've said this so many times that our therapists here at Hope House are second to none, and we just appreciate everything that you do every day for our clients, for a group. I know one-on-one counseling sessions that you have. I love the empowerment that you both share with our survivors of domestic violence, because there is life after domestic violence, and thank you so much for coming on.